Welcome to Evolving Ideas. I'm Elaine Smitha, and my guest is Tams Allen, a historian, actress, or actress historian, however you want to phrase this, who does these wonderful historical overviews of what life was like in another period. And this show is dealing with the life of a Victorian servant. Join us shortly after we get our graphics over, and we'll take you on a journey to another moment in time. Welcome to Evolving Ideas. I'm Elaine Smitha. We are dedicated to new and innovative concepts to help us to grow beyond where we are, to evolve to a greater state of awareness. And we just have wonderful guests and subjects to help you be better informed so you can make better decisions in your life. Join me in welcoming Tams Allen, my actress historian personality, actually. Fabulous woman. And you do things for the Department of Humanities here in the state of Washington.
I do work for the Washington Commission for the Humanities as one of their inquiring mind speakers. Mm-hmm. I also tour all over the nation doing these one-woman historical shows that are educational entertainment, because I feel it's really important to show people what it was like to live in another time period, no matter how weird that seems to us, so that they will have more tolerance for the things that are different in their own lives.
That's
and
good.
That message does seem to be getting across.
Well, I think that you are providing a valuable service.
I hope so.
Well, you are. And I think it's, for this, we have a new audience. I think it'd be fun for them to find out about how you got into this in the first place.
Well, I have 3 degrees in theater and 1 in history. And I acted, I danced with the ballet company, I costumed, I stage managed, and I got tired of starving. So I sat down with a book called What Color is Your Parachute? And I made a list of all the things I really liked about my job and all the things I really hated about my job and some of my dreams of what I wanted to do. And I combined them together to create these programs. And actually my husband really encouraged me to do this. And I said, nobody's going to want to listen to me talk about what it was like to live in another time period while I'm getting dressed in period costume. And he said, trust me, they'll be enthralled. So we make the joke in our household, I do a reverse strip tease. I go out on stage in my skivvies and I get dressed in all the clothing. Of course, it's in hoops and petticoats.
Right.
And some of the costumes I wear weigh up to 200 pounds.
Well, I think perhaps the first show that you and I did together was that one where you were the Victorian traveler.
Yes.
And you had to have 2 handmaidens to help you with your garments. It was quite an amazing show. And this, I don't know, we've done 3 or 4 shows, haven't we?
We've actually done 6.
Oh, have
this
we really?
This is number 7.
Oh, my goodness, really? Oh, gosh, how time flies. Well, we've been doing this over a period of years. And anyway, I think this is a fascinating subject because people do need to know how another era was so they can appreciate what they got right now.
And tonight what we're going to talk about is the life of a servant, the people who live downstairs, the invisible half of the population for England at this time. It's Americans are fascinated with servants because we didn't grow up with them as much as the English did, particularly in this time period.
Right.
And it's a real shocking look at what these people went through.
Mm-hmm. Life wasn't really like it is today.
Oh, good Lord, no. Not at all.
And you say that half of the population was in service?
Half of England's population was in domestic service because during the Victorian time period, there was a mass migration there was a mass migration from the country into the city, people looking for work. And domestic service was the most readily available employment, that and factory work. And your only other options were to starve underneath the bridges or to go to the workhouses, which the workhouses were awful, awful bleak places. Men and women were separated, so you never saw your spouse again. You were given work during the day,
Really?
a bowl of gruel to eat at night, and you slept in this long wooden box, and they gave you a blanket. And if you died in the night, they took the blanket, they took your clothes and your shoes, because there was a big business in secondhand shoes, and they just nailed a lid down on that box.
I was going to say, you're almost sleeping in your coffin.
And shipped it out, and you were lucky if your spouse was even notified of your death.
Oh, my goodness.
And of course, the only other option then for women was to turn to prostitution. And a very large number of these women found themselves on the street with that being their only option.
Wow.
So domestic service was legitimate work to do. And there was so much child labor at this point. I mean, we think of child labor laws being in place forever, but they weren't.
No.
At all. And during this time, the child labor laws didn't exist, so children worked 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. And they started these work days at 5 years old. And the most common job for a 5-year-old to have, a 5 and a 6-year-old, was to take care of the siblings that were younger than them.
Of course.
And this is why there was so much infant mortality, because what modern person today could think of leaving 5 or 6 kids in the care of a 6-year-old for 12 hours a day?
That's a long time. Well, I think that a lot of people today don't quite appreciate the amount of effort that goes into caring for that many children, and to have the children old. I mean, it makes perfect sense, but if you were in a family with a lot of children, why the older ones would take care of the younger ones.
But not at that age.
Well, no, not at 6. That's a little young.
Or these children would go to work in the factories. Again, they would work 12 to 16 hours a day, usually for a penny a day or less,
Right.
where they lost their limbs and very frequently lost their lives because they were given the most dangerous jobs to do.
Oh, my.
And the other option, of course, were the orphanages. And the orphanages were considered training grounds for domestic service.
Of course, I could see where that would be.
But the one job you never wanted to be picked for if you were in an orphanage was when the chimney sweeps came through, because they wanted small little kids that they could hoist up into the chimneys, where they would physically scrape the sides of the chimney.
Oh, my.
And if you
This isn't a Harry Potter story.
No. And if you didn't work fast enough, they would light a fire in the grate to make you move faster up the chimney.
Oh, my. That was a little brutal, wasn't it?
It was very, very brutal. It's more the time of Oliver Twist than Harry Potter.
Yeah, really. Yes. Well, I think here in our country today with the child labor laws, I think they maybe have gone just a bit too far, because the kids used to be able to deliver newspapers, and it gave them some useful purpose, and they had little income, and now instead of having something to do in that regard that was really useful and purposeful, they're out on the street.
Yeah.
So, sometimes we go to extremes, and obviously this is the far extreme.
This was definitely the far extreme.
Really. So, who was in charge now and downstairs? Who were all the component elements?
Well,
Yeah, the butler, the cook.
okay. Let me first talk a little bit about what it was like to go into service, because that kind of ties into your question there. They're a combination there.
Right.
You went into service. Normally, again, these large country families could not feed all their children, and they knew if they put their children into service, they would be fed, and that they would have a roof over their head, because part of your wages was that you were fed 3 meals a day. Now, only one of those meals was a hot meal at 1 o'clock. But you were at least given three meals a day. You were given a roof over your head, and many servants took pride in the address that they lived in.
Oh, yes.
Because they can say, I live on Belgravia Square.
Oh, yes.
Even though they're from the countryside.
So it was really a matter of survival.
Definitely a matter of survival. And as the century progressed, the mistresses of the household took an active social role in making sure that their servants learned to read and write.
Oh, that was
because there was no mandatory schooling until the 1880s in Britain. And when that happened, when the law passed, the poor people just screamed bloody murder, because they lost half their income for the family, because the children had to go to school instead of go to work.
Okay, so what would be the year that you are really addressing earlier? What would have been, we're talking later in the 1800s.
Well, I'm
But
talking
you-
about the whole servant issue through the entire let's say 1840s,
Okay.
all the way through to the First World War.
Okay, that's what kind of where I
Yeah,
wanted
that'll
to get
give you a
that
good
frame of
time
reference.
frame. And I'm dressed as a parlor maid from about the 1880s.
Okay, so what would be the qualifications here?
Well, for a parlor maid, I would have worked my way through the ranks to get there.
So what's the starting base?
What your starting base is you start off, if you're a girl, you start off as a scullery maid. Now, the scullery maid had to scrub all the pots and pans, all the floors. She had to get up and scrub the floors in enough time for them to dry before the other servants had to get up at 5 in the morning.
Oh, my.
And often she would do this, pushing a candle in front of her. These
Oh,
were
dear.
the youngest girls, okay? The boys, the youngest boys, were boot boys. They scrubbed everybody's boots and those kind of jobs, or the stable lads. And then the next level up would be, for a girl, you would be a kitchen maid. And today we would almost call her a sous chef. She would chop all the vegetables and scrub all the vegetables and begin learning the trade of a cook if she wanted to go that direction. For the boys, you would become a groom if you're working outdoors. Your next step up would be to be an undermaid. Now, the undermaids had the real hard physical labor. A maid carries a heavy coal scuttle up the stairs. The footman or butler carries a letter.
Oh, dear.
The
Big
but
difference.
there was no chivalry amongst the servant class here at all. So your undermaids are the ones who light the fires. They normally started their days at 5 in the morning. They got up, they scrubbed and swept the front porch, scrubbed the door, polished the brass on the door. A parlor maid, my job would be to get up to open the shutters, start dusting, because the maids had to get all the downstairs work done before 9 o'clock when the family came downstairs for breakfast.
So the family did come downstairs to
They
where
came downstairs to breakfast at 9, and that's when the maids would go upstairs to clean the bedrooms.
Oh, I see.
While they were at breakfast.
So how about the eating arrangement? Was there one table that everyone sat at, and that
The family had their
family-
area upstairs. The servants
Oh, I
ate in
see.
the
Okay,
servants'
okay.
hall. And
Okay.
yes, we would, in a smaller household, we would all eat at one table. In a larger household, the upper servants ate in the housekeeper's room, and the under servants ate in the servant hall. And this hierarchy, England has never had a caste system like there was with the servants. Because if a housekeeper, who's the highest servant, and I'll get to her in a minute, and if I'm a parlor maid, I cannot say good morning to her until she first says good morning to me. I cannot greet anybody above me in station until they greet me.
Till they acknowledge your
I
presence.
can't talk at the table unless somebody above me asks me a question. It was very, very rigid in this. So you have your undermaids and the grooms for the boys, and then the next stage up would be to be a housemaid for the girls. And these poor women, I have a part in my program where I talk about the woe of a maid. Now, the woe of a maid is, yes, the hard work, housemaid's knees from being on your hands and knees. Think about this. Ask your audience, when was the last time they got on their hands and knees and scrubbed and waxed a floor?
Well, I've done it myself.
Recently?
Well, I wash it. Yes, I've done it on my hands and knees.
Good. Good for you. These people did it every day.
Well, I don't do it every day.
But the real trouble is in connection with the sexual mores of the time. Victorian men were supposed to have a great deal of sexual experience before they came to their wedding bed, and girls were supposed to know nothing at all.
I see.
Where do these men get this experience?
With
They corner the poor maid in the library.
Oh, my gosh.
If she screams, she loses her job.
Oh, my.
If she becomes pregnant, she loses her job because it's her fault.
Oh, dear.
And if she resists the master, she loses her job. If she's found out by the mistress, she loses her job. It's always the servant's fault, no matter what.
Amazing.
And this was a real problem if you had a very lecherous master in the household, but more of a problem with the young master, particularly those who had gone away to college and would bring their college friends home
Oh, dear.
for the
Oh,
weekend.
Dear. Oh, dear. Oh, dear.
This was a real problem for the woe of the maid. Now, next step up, you would become a parlor maid. I answer the door in the afternoon. I serve at meals. It's my job to polish the silver, to take care of the china. See, I'm getting away from the scrubbing of the
Yes,
floors
I
at
see
this
that.
point.
You're moving up.
I'm moving up in the world.
Right.
The men took a little bit different shift. You had the indoor and the outdoor. For the outdoor, the next major jump in as far as you could go for a man was to become the coachman, which later would become the chauffeur. This is the only servant that the master hired. The mistress did not hire the coachman. And the coachman was judged on how smooth a ride he could give. He had to be ready in 20 minutes' notice, carriage, horses, and all. And the master said 4 miles an hour, 10 miles an hour, and the coachman had to maintain that speed.
My. Interesting.
On the indoor, you start at the bottom, as your boot boy, but you move up next to a position called a tiger. And I love this. This is a young man who either rides postilion on the horses. So if you have a coach and 4, he's the guy who's riding that lead horse to help control if something happens. Or more often than not, he hung on the outside of the carriage to kick off anybody who tried to freeload and hitch a ride on the outside of the carriage.
Oh, dear.
He often carried a long staff to beat them off.
Oh, my gosh. Well, just hold it right there.
Sure.
I want to make sure that those of you who have tuned in late, I want you to know that we're talking with Tams Allen, who is an actress historian, and we're talking about the life of a Victorian servant. And there is a picture here on this brochure of hers that gives us some indication of the style of those in that particular era from around 1840 up to the Civil War.
First World War.
First World War, sorry, the First World War. Get this straight. Okay.
Well, it's interesting you showed that picture because that picture shows a footman there. And the footmen were divided into 2 areas. You had the running footman and you had the house footman. Now, when footmen applied for a job, they had to be over 6 feet tall, and they had to have good calves. So, we have this sexual harassment now when women go for a job, never ask, what do your legs look like?
Right.
That was standard for these men, because a running footman had to maintain a speed of 6 miles per hour for 60 miles on end. And they had to be able to do that every day.
Oh, no.
So, and their job was to run alongside the carriage with a big cudgel to beat off would-be robbers.
Oh, gosh. Sounds horrible.
From the footman, they would move to an under-butler, and then from an under-butler maybe to a valet, and then to the butler, who is the head of the men servants. And like the housekeeper, who's head of the female servants, they were responsible for the care of the servants, for their well-being, but also for their morals. Now, on the women, we got up to the parlor maid, and above the parlor maid was the lady's maid. Obviously, she took care of her mistress. Actually, the cook would come below her. And the temperament of the cook really set the pace for the household. The butler and the housekeeper thought that they ran the house. It's not true. They may have run it.
The cook runs
but the cook really set the temperament for it. And it could be a horrible place to live in if the cook was upset. Everybody made sure the cook was well appeased at all times, including the family. The family went in dread of the cook quitting, particularly if she was a good cook. She had power that way. The ladies' maid and valet took care of their master and mistress's clothing, and then the housekeeper and the butler were above them. Now, the housekeeper carried a ring of keys. She was the keeper of the keys. Everything was locked up, all the sugar, all the tea, everything, the linen, so nothing could be stolen. But the dread of the jangling of the keys struck terror in the hearts of many of undermaid who was trying to get the underfootman into the broom closet with her for a short time. The keys would warn them very, very much so. The one servant who didn't fit in either category or really anywhere was the poor governess. And the loneliness of a governess was very, very bleak. She wasn't part of the family. She wasn't part of the servants. She was a middle-class woman who had some education. She was expected to educate the children. She ate alone. Her whole life was spent alone. The only affection she got was from the children. And she really didn't fit anywhere in the household. So she was kind of a nebulous person there. In that sense.
And do you have more to add to that? Because I wanted to ask you what was the difference between working for aristocracy and working for the middle class?
Well, I wanted to add one more thing. When you went into service, you not only lost your family and where you came from, but you lost your identity as well.
Really?
Because the family changed servants so often that They didn't think anything of wanting to spend the time to learn new names. So the lady's maid was always Rose, and the first footman was always Thomas.
No matter what.
No matter what your name was, you lost your identity and became this particular person.
How interesting.
Also, on the same level, dismissal could come for any reason. You have some of these households were very, very large. So you have a large number of people trying to get along. If you fit in, great. If you didn't, or if, like, the upper maid didn't like you, you could lose your job. And when you went to get another job, you had to have something called a character reference. Now, you may have your last 6 employers give you incredible character references, and the last employer not, and you will never work again.
Oh, my.
And your only option is then you're out on the streets. And this is very, very bad.
Yes.
In that. And they were really treated as second-class citizens.
Obviously.
And the upper-class people felt that the servants, they don't feel the cold like we do. They don't need to eat the same food that we do.
So they really just looked on them as chattel, really.
Very much as chattel. I remember reading an account where an upper servant's talking to a lower servant saying, "You should be thankful, girl. They feed us real butter here and not margarine."
Oh.
Because the food was that different. There was food for upstairs and food for downstairs.
How interesting.
So you didn't feel the cold. You were second-class citizens. And I would really like to tell you Jenny's story here.
Okay.
I read the account of a woman named Jenny. And this is turn of the century. And Jenny was a Scottish woman.
When we're talking turn of the century, we mean...
Turn of the 19th, yes,
yeah,
to the
really,
20th century. I forgot we're in the millennium now.
Right.
But she excelled in school, particularly in mathematics, so much so that she got a scholarship to go to college. But her father was a drunkard, her mother had an injury, she had a younger sister at home, so she gave up her scholarship to go into service to help support her family. Well, the family moved to London, and Jenny decided to go with them because she figured, I'll have better opportunities in London. On one of her days off, she found a sign, "Help Wanted," in a store. And she went into the store, and they had a particular test for her to take. It consisted of a bunch of accounting-type things. And she passed the test with flying colors. And the man was just like, "We've never had an applicant who has scored so high. This is perfect. You have good people skills. When can you start?" And she said, "Well, I have to give 2 weeks' notice." And I said, 2 weeks' notice? Well, where are you working? She said, "Well, I'm a cook at this household." And they said, "Oh, servants need not apply."
Oh, really?
And that's the way it was.
Oh, my.
There's a story of a woman who was a cook whose sister married a draper. Now, she cooked for one of the people who sat in the House of Parliament. So she's not a cook in a middle-class house. She's a cook in a very high-grade house. She lived on Downing Street.
Oh, golly, that's a popular street.
We're talking very high class.
Yes, we are.
And her sister married a draper. She could not call on her sister at the front door. She had to go to the back door because she was a servant.
Oh, dear.
She would never be allowed in the front door to the parlor.
Yeah, so we really didn't need a caste system, did we? Because they already had one.
They definitely had one.
They had one.
And when the family would go away, in the spring in particular, they would go to the countryside. The servants were left in the household to do the deep spring cleaning. And this cleaning really had to be done because they're burning coal fires, so things get very dirty.
Right.
But they put you on something called board wages, which meant that your food was cut, you were paid half your normal wages because you weren't waiting on the family.
Oh.
But the work was just the same.
Yes.
So what the servants did is they formed kind of like this underground committee because the families didn't all leave at the same time, and they would invite servants from other houses.
Oh, really? They'd sneak in and help
They'd have them come in. No, not help them, but have them come in and eat with them. Because board wages went down to almost bread and water.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So they got to eat better.
So instead of having one hot meal a day, you'd have one hot meal a week.
Oh, my.
Instead. And cook was usually really good about making a big pot roast that could be made into soup, that could be made into hash, that could be made into so it would last.
Very creative cooking.
You had to be. Very, very much so on that. But there were perks with the job, too. Particularly for a cook. She got the drippings from the pan, the grease, what we would say today, and she could sell that.
Really?
She would make her own contracts with the tradesmen and make deals with them. Okay, this is how much a goose costs. How much are you going to sell it to me for? Okay, I'll split the difference with you.
Oh my goodness,
So
negotiation.
there were ways that you could make money under the table without the head housekeeper or the mistress finding out. Those were the perks of your job that way.
So as part of this, do you have any idea as to what the cost would be, say, for a goose?
Well, in today's standards, it would sound like pittance to us.
Of course, I
You know,
understand
it
that,
would
but I
be
just to give us
30
some
pence,
relativity.
40 pence for a goose, let's say. But you have to understand that, you know, the lady's maid made 20 pounds a year. A cook, a good cook, right before the First World War, made 40 pounds a year. A scullery maid made 1 pound a year.
Oh dear.
That's it. So, you know, it's all very relative to that.
Yes, yes, I see that. That's
Very, very
interesting.
relative to that.
So the aristocracy and the middle class,
The aristocracy, if you could work for them, it was great.
because you'd have a better address to begin with, right?
You have a better address, but also the fact that
More perks?
More perks, but these people cared about their servants. These people were very comfortable. They had had servants for centuries. They knew that they needed these people to run their households.
Right.
These people they were not family, they were more like retainers. A different theory that way. If you got sick, they called their own doctors in. If
So they really cared about the people.
Yes, and also in an aristocratical household, you could move through the ranks within one household. So you could start off as a boot boy and wind up as the butler in that same household. Whereas with the middle class, if you want any advancement, you have to quit and start another job and apply for
Really?
the next level up.
Oh my goodness.
And that's the only way it worked.
Interesting.
So, you know, and the houses of the nobility had, you know, anywhere from 30 to 300 servants in each
Really?
house.
Oh my goodness.
Well, if you look at the country estates, you have to add all the gamekeepers and the dog handlers and all those kind of people to your staff. You don't have one groom, you have 6 grooms because you have a stable full of horses.
Right.
So very, very different from the middle class. Middle class had 3 to 13 servants in their household. In the middle classes, if you got sick, they threw you out on the street. Rarely would they give you a day of bed rest. Even if you've got pneumonia and they're dying, they'll throw you out on the street.
Gosh, it's unbelievable that, you know, this was our heritage. And I wanted to ask you, Tams, did they grow their own gardens and provide their own food, or how did that work?
In the country, yes, you definitely grew your own food. Even the nobility had large gardens. There was a whole hierarchy of head gardeners, and then the gardeners that grew flowers, and the gardeners that did fruit, and the gardeners that did vegetables, and those that specifically pruned, and under gardeners, and gardener boys, and all of that. There were poultrymen, there were dairymen, all of that were connected.
So they were pretty well self-contained.
For the aristocracy, very
aristocracy.
much, yes, in the country. And often, you know, they had country houses, they had city houses
Right.
for the social season. You went to London.
Right.
They would have things shipped from their country houses to the city. Remember, the post came 5 times a day. We would never think of shipping a dead, you know, chicken that's already been plucked through the mail today, but they could do that and it would arrive still fine.
Oh my.
Because the mail came 5 times a day. In the urban areas, yes, there were gardens, definitely. The servants usually didn't take care of that. Again, you're dealing with a middle-class family. In London itself, by this time, no, people do not have cows in their backyard like they did at the beginning of the 19th century. It's very difficult to grow vegetables because of the pollution. You know, everybody's
Now, we don't
burning
think
coal.
about pollution then. We think about, you know...
Think of the pea soup fog. Think of Sherlock Holmes with the pea
Yes,
soup fog and that
yes.
yellow fog. You know why it's yellow? Because of all the coal dust in the air. And all the raw sewage going right into the Thames
That's
River. And, you know, if you fell into the Thames, you were dead. You know, and cholera epidemics are still running rampant in London. None of the drains are covered. Everybody has open cesspools in the back of their houses. This is why disease is running very rampant.
Got it.
It doesn't come until the turn of the 20th century. It doesn't really come till Victoria dies and Edward takes the throne. And one of the first things he does is he really focuses on drains and getting people to cover the drains and to get rid of the cesspools, and particularly in the royal residences of doing that. This was a typhoid, cholera, diphtheria, things we don't even think of were common, very, very common.
Amazing, amazing. Well, I want to just make sure that my viewers know that we're talking with Tams Allen, who is an actress historian, and we're discussing the life of a Victorian servant and what it was like to live in those days. And it's a fascinating thing. Did you want to go on? I wanted to talk to you about the rules for the servants' hall.
Well, rules for servants and rules for the servants' hall kind of go together. And
what would be the difference?
Well, the rules for the servants' hall pertain to the room itself.
Oh.
Okay, so the room itself had to be cleaned every day. This was lighting fires, laying the cloth for the tablecloth out, setting the table, cleaning the room. And the servants did this in rotation. So you had to make sure that when your time was done, everything was in its place, everything was clean, just passing it down that way. You could not cuss in the servants' hall. There was a fine of 1 pence if you did. There was a fine of 2 pence or 6 strokes with the boot on your breechin.
On your breechin?
This is how they phrased it, of course. For doing things like cutting too much bread, wasting anything, breaking anything, taking things out of the servants' hall that needed to stay in there, wiping your silverware on the tablecloth. You have to remember, these were country people coming into the city, particularly the underservants. A lot of them were Irish and Welsh and Scots, and they were really looked down upon because they weren't English, of course.
I see.
So
that
those
strata of superiority.
Definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Leaving muddy boots around, messing up, making a mess and not cleaning it up immediately. Those were things you were fined for. If you broke anything, the mistress had the last decision on how much was taken out of your wage, if it was an accident or not.
Mm-hmm.
So
you probably come in and have the inquisitor ask you all these questions, right?
Oh, yes. So these are the rules for the servants' hall itself. Now, rules for servants were that you never spoke to any of the family upstairs unless they addressed you. You always had downcast eyes, and you said, yes, miss, yes, ma'am, or yes, sir. You always called the children miss or master. You never joined in a conversation. If somebody made a joke in front of you, you were not allowed to laugh. You were not allowed to give input into the conversation.
So it was almost like you were not a part of that. And,
no, you were a piece of furniture.
And you were not listening to what was going on.
You were a piece of furniture. You were there to pour and to fetch and to carry. Mm-hmm. If you are doing work in a room and one of the family comes in, you are to leave immediately unless you're laying a fire, and then to do it as quickly as possible and get out. The family was never supposed to see a servant at work.
Ah.
So if for some reason you're cleaning something and they come in the hallway,
you have to get out of the way.
No, you plaster yourself against the hallway and you become part of the wallpaper until they pass you.
Oh my.
You know, you do not exist for them that way.
Oh my.
This goes back to you don't feel the cold, you don't need the same food. It's all that same kind of headspace. Mm-hmm. You're not allowed to walk in the garden if any of the family are home. Mm-hmm. You should not sing or whistle at all. You should not talk from room to room. You know, if I'm in one room making a bed and you're in the other room making a bed, I don't call to you.
No conversation.
No. If we're in the same room, we can have very low conversation, but we're not even supposed to really talk to each other.
Almost whispering, huh?
When we're upstairs. Downstairs, it's a different story. The cook was constantly screaming at the scullery maids and the kitchen maids, but that couldn't be heard upstairs at all. And there was also this real split in the lodgings for servants. The women servants slept up in the attic.
Oh, really?
And this is really harsh. There's no insulation yet. So in the winter, you froze. In the summer, you roasted. Sometimes there was a window you could open, but they didn't want you to open these windows because, afraid of somebody crawling through them.
But weren't they like tiered houses?
Oh,
yeah.
Sure, but you ever heard of a second-story man?
Yes.
And the other thing about these lodgings for these servants is that you shared a bed. Mm-hmm. So all the housemaids slept in one bed together.
Oh, dear.
So you could change your bed partners as jobs changed, and you might have somebody sleeping next to you who had bad noise and snored all night long, and you just had to deal with it. Mm-hmm. The only people who had their own bed were the upper servants, the housekeeper, the cook, the lady's maid, the butler, the valet, those kind of people. And it was awful that way. Now, the men servants almost had it worse. They had to sleep in the basement. And the footmen in particular had these fold-out cots where they would sleep in front of the silver cupboard with a cudgel right beside their bed. So if anybody came in to steal anything, they were ready there to beat them up.
Oh, my goodness.
But the basements had no windows. Water ran on the walls. It would become icy in the wintertime.
Right. I remember when I was back in Asheville, North Carolina, and I went through the mansion back there and down into the basement where all this was, where all the servants were. And it was amazing. It was amazing to see the conditions that the servants lived under.
Well, part of that is that England put a tax on windows. So the family did not put any windows.
Tax on windows.
Tax on glass. After one of their wars, this is how they raised revenue. And so the family didn't put any windows where the servants were, because why should they pay tax? There was also a tax on male servants, not on female servants. This made the shift of power happen, so that there became more female servants than men servants.
How interesting.
But there was a building inspector that came through one of the houses. I read about this. And he poked in this room, and there was literal water running off the walls. It was dank, no windows. It was awful, horrid room, and it was off the kitchen. You know, and he was saying, you can't store food in here. And the mistress said, oh, don't worry about that. Only one of the servants sleep in there. Again, that second-class citizen type of view.
Amazing, and really amazing. So what would one of these servants do on their day off?
Well, you have to understand, days off didn't exist in the beginning of the 19th century. By mid-century, you got one day a month off. And by the time of the First World War, you got every other Sunday off. Again, this is a very lonely existence for these people. You went to the library, the museum, the park, anything that was free, and anything where you could get out of the weather. You went to tea shops to eat, because if it's your day off, you're not allowed to eat in the household with the other servants.
Oh.
You're not allowed to stay in the household in your room. You have to go out.
Really? So where would you sleep?
Well, you would come home, and that's the thing. There was a curfew. And if you missed that curfew and the doors were closed, you had to sleep on the front stoop until, or the back step, not the front, of course, the back stairs.
Until morning.
Until morning came. And this was very rigidly enforced. But the only people you know are the other servants in the household.
Right.
And so you don't know anybody out there. And you don't want to strike up friendships with strangers, because this could lead to a lot of problems. You see, when maids took their jobs, you couldn't be married, okay? There was no work for married people, and you were not allowed to have any followers. This is boyfriends. And you've heard the term old maid.
Yes.
This is what it's referring to.
Really?
This is what it's referring to. And the only romance you can have are what they call backdoor romances. You were allowed 5 minutes with the butcher boy making his delivery, or with the baker boy making his delivery, to talk over the fence. Now, this is not real conducive of getting a relationship together. So the only eligible men, because the master and his sons don't count, are the other male servants who are not about to be saddled with a wife, because they're trying to save their money so they can move up in station and have something for retirement. Then they'll get married. But if they marry, then they have to support the woman. It's not until after the First World War that you have married couples taking jobs.
Interesting. But so their whole life was spent on trying to move up the ranks.
If you could.
If you could.
If you could. The person who had it the absolute worst was the maid of all work.
The maid of all work, that was her title?
That was her title. She was a single servant in the household. She had to do it all, and all by herself. She lived in the basement, totally alone. She had no contact with anybody, except she had to take care of the children while she cooked the meals, did all the cleaning, ran all the errands, everything by herself. And she was usually a young person. This was usually her first job. And the reason why she had it the worst is because of the people she worked for. She usually did not work for the middle class. She worked for somebody who had just come out of the lower class. They are now, for the first time, being able to hire a servant.
You mean the original yuppie?
No, not even the original yuppie, because they have to constantly prove to this poor girl that they are above her in station now. And they made impossible demands upon these poor girls. And they changed servants constantly because it was very difficult to find a maid of all work who would stay. But many women did prefer that than working in the household with the rigidity of the hierarchy.
Did they have a little bit more freedom, did they, in some regards?
In some regards, that they set their own pace as long as they got the work done. And, you know, they ate when they could, not at set hours. So in that sense, we would say it's almost like somebody who's self-employed. But not quite, because the work was probably 20 hours a day to get it all done.
And that's every day?
Every day,
so they got
6
like
days a week,
4 hours
no day
sleep.
off, or 7 days a week, no day off if you're a maid of all work.
Amazing.
That was the harshest, probably the harshest. They had the same type of drudgery life as the women who worked in the mines. Really.
Well, that's an interesting correlation. It brings up quite a picture.
It does, because
It
you're in the
does.
dank, dark
Exactly.
basement, being in a dank, dark mine.
Right, because a lot of those people who worked in those mines didn't have really a good life.
Oh no, if you were a miner, you were lucky to make it to 20. Age of consent for marriage was 13.
Oh, really?
Because, well, even the
They
very,
wouldn't
very
live till
wealthy
20.
people who had the best medical advice only lived to be 50.
Really?
A working class person like me, as a parlor maid, I would be lucky to make it to 40. And the people who worked in the mines were lucky to make it to 20 because of the
Interesting.
danger of the work.
Really? Really? Do you want to talk a little bit about your outfit?
Well,
You make all yours, right?
I make all my own clothing, except my corsets. I have a professional corseteer. She's a godsend. I am dressed for the afternoon. When I got up in the morning, I would wear a calico-type dress, or a dress with a print, and a smock-type apron for doing the heavy cleaning work. After we had our what we would call supper, which would be at 1 o'clock, that's our hot meal of the day, I would go upstairs and change into my afternoon clothes, which is a black dress, white collar and cuffs, and a white apron and a white cap. This is so that I am presentable for answering the door in the afternoon. And most of the servants did have morning clothes and afternoon clothes. So you had to have at least 2 uniforms when you went into service. Some of the girls couldn't even afford that, and their mistress would dock that out of their pay.
So did they have to buy their own uniforms and so
They
forth?
had to make them.
They had to make their own uniforms, so the house, the people of the house did not provide any of these at all?
Nothing at all.
So how did they get the money to even buy the fabric to make them in the first place?
You got a job and it was taken out of your wage. There were also agencies that helped these girls. Usually in the country, you go to work for the vicar's wife and get a little bit of training, earn enough for the fabric to be given to you.
I see.
So, of course, they were very ill-fitting clothes, and as you move up the ranks, your clothes fit you better because you develop better needle skills, or somebody in the household does.
Right, you learn how to do it better.
Right.
And they were all hand-done, too.
Oh, definitely.
Because they
Everything
didn't
by
have the
hand.
sewing machines then.
Well, there were sewing machines.
Not to that degree like
not,
we are
not for
familiar.
this level of society, no. A lady's maid's, one of her jobs is her mistress would be able to show her a picture of a costume that she liked, or a dress, and the lady's maid should look at the picture and be able to make it. That was one of her skills.
Yes, all that creative action. Now, the fabric, are you authentic on the type of
Very,
fabric?
very heavy cotton or wool to be worn, a lighter weight wool in the summertime, if I'm lucky. Otherwise, it's wool or heavy cotton, mostly wool. Wool breathes, but you have to understand there's no central heating, so you need this to keep warm.
Right.
And I would have undergarments. Of course, it would be very coarse, and I would wear a corset. Everybody, even the women in the mines, wore some form of a corset.
Oh, can you imagine being in the mines wearing a corset? I mean, that, my goodness sake.
Yes.
I mean, you're crawling around and oh.
And a woman's job in the mines, so if you want to go that direction, is you would go at least a mile beneath the surface. There would be this huge cart filled with the ore, and there would be this huge chain. And you drag this chain between your legs, wrap it around on your waist, hook it on, and then crawl on your hands and knees to the mine surface. Women were used as pit ponies because they were much less expensive to keep than a horse would have been.
Oh, gosh.
And it wasn't until the mid-1840s when they passed the Coal Act that women no longer were used as pit ponies. So think about doing that in a corset.
Oh, my gosh. Well,
And think about doing that in a corset and being pregnant.
Oh, I can't even imagine doing it in the first place, much less be pregnant.
As we were talking about days out, there wasn't a lot open to these girls to do, or for the men folk for that. But, life wasn't all doom and gloom. You make your own fun. Mm-hmm. And particularly if you have a group of people who really get along together. Mm-hmm. In the evening you might sing. And in the evening when work was done, you were on call, of course, to the family. You sat in a servant's hall and read and did things. But the butler can say, it's time for you to go to bed now. Now, it doesn't matter if you're an older woman. The butler will tell you when it's time for you to retire.
So the butler was in charge of the bedtime, was he?
Well, the butler and the housekeeper, they were just in charge of everything downstairs. And the distinction, again, upper and lower servants, the lady's maid and the cook and the housekeeper were always referred to as Mrs. and your last name, whether you were married or not. The butler had the distinction of being called by his last name by the family.
Oh.
And this was an honor. Instead of Jane, it would be, if your last name is Smith, it'd be Smith, open the door for the lady, as opposed to George, do this. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that gave you a certain degree a little bit higher up.
Oh, interesting. Well, just hang on here. I
Sure.
want to let people who may have tuned in late that we're talking with Tams Allen, who's an actress historian, and about the life of a Victorian servant. And this has been a very interesting interview because we're learning a lot about what life was like then, and certainly, oh my goodness, I think we're so much better off today. No question about that.
I agree with you.
Yes, really.
Now, one of the other perks that they could do, or hijinks or fun that they would have, mm-hmm. is particularly if you were in the country or out in the more what we would call suburban areas, there were dances. Like we would call them Grange Hall dances today. And after work was done, you'd sneak out of the house and you'd go and dance for 5 or 6 hours. After working an 18-hour day, you have to understand, you'd be up to work another 18-hour day. But it was fun and it was something out of the household.
Mm-hmm. Need a little break in the sequence of things.
A little break, and usually it was the underservants who did this. Mm-hmm. And usually the upper servants were complacent on this. I read one account of a country house where they all went out to dance, and the butler was always in cahoots with them of leaving the back door unlocked. Now, the butler's job at night was to make the rounds, to make sure everything is locked up. That is his job. So he was really going out on the limb for the people who worked under him. Well, one night, the master of the house made rounds after the butler went to bed.
Oh, dear.
And locked the back door.
Oh, dear.
And they came back and couldn't get in. Mm-hmm. Well, the only open window was on the 3rd floor.
Oh, dear.
And they hoisted somebody up to crawl across to get in. They crawled down. And when the butler found out the next morning, he was just pale as a sheet. He said, somebody could have fallen. Then look at the trouble we would have been in.
Oh, yes.
You should have woken me up. And of course the butler got a talking, dressing down by the master for leaving the back door open.
Oh, of course, of course.
And then the big event that all the servants look forward to, those in the house of the nobility, not of the middle class, was that around the Yuletide, around the Christmas season, there would be a servants' ball. Now this is something to look forward to. Your aprons and caps came off, and the aprons and caps, you have to understand, were your badge of office. You were required to wear them all the time. Even in church on Sunday, there was division between master and servant on earth, and in heaven, they believed.
I see.
So in church, you were not equal with your master. You had to sit up in the balcony, segregated, all of that.
Well, some groups are still doing that.
Yes. So aprons and caps came off. Your outdoor clothes came on. You made them look as pretty as possible. The master and mistress provide food and drink. They brought other people in to serve you. Live music. And the master and mistress came downstairs to open the servants' ball, where the master would take the housekeeper and the mistress would take the butler for the first dance.
Oh, really?
And
that kind of a courtesy thing?
That kind of courtesy thing, and they opened this up and you danced the night away, and you didn't have to start your work the next day until like 9 o'clock.
I see.
Which gave you 4 extra hours in bed, which probably you wouldn't spend in bed. You would probably still be dancing almost till you had to start your work. But this was something that they really looked forward to.
How often did they have these dances?
Once a year.
Only once?
Right around the holiday time. Of course, not on the holiday time because the family are doing their parties. This would be, after New Year's, around that time. Almost like a 12th night celebration. In a way. And this was really something to look forward to.
And, well, do you have more to add on this?
No.
I was going to ask you, now what about retirement? When they were through doing all this, what happened to them?
Well, you were lucky to retire. And
probably lived long enough to retire, right?
Lived long enough to retire. again, if you work for the middle classes, you got too old, they just threw you out on the streets. I mean, you're
What were you supposed
crockery.
to do then?
Go to the workhouses, sleep under the bridges and die, or what happened many a time for the women, again, prostitution.
Well, that's the oldest profession.
Yeah, and unfortunately, you know, with the sexual mores of the time, there was
Yes.
a lot of prostitution going on. But if you did manage to save enough money, and the people who only really did this were the upper servants. The lower servants didn't make enough to save anything, because all the servants would send money home. No matter how little you made, you sent
Really?
money home. So the scullery maid making £1 a year would send at least half of that home to her parents. At least. That leaves her 50 pence for the whole year. And on her days out, when she has a day off, she has to feed herself.
So her parents wouldn't have any income, and they would
would
rely
have-
upon this?
No, they would have some of them, most of them had some kind of income, but remember, you got 12, 15 kids in the household. You're the one who's got a job.
Uh-huh.
Think about the Depression in America in the 1930s. No matter what family member had a job, they were sending money to the family members that were at home.
You
to
know,
help
there's
them
still
survive.
this is still happening today in certain cultures.
Very much so. Very, very much so. So if you did save the money, again, these are the upper servants. Often the butler would marry either the housekeeper or the cook. You know, they've lived with this person for a long time under the same household. They work, they know how each other work. These were good matches. Or they would combine with the butler, the housekeeper, the cook, and one of the upper maids, and they would open a pub. Or they would open a seaside resort. That combination made really, really good for opening the seaside resort. And these the pubs in particular were run by butlers, ex-butlers, because part of the butler's duty was taking care of the family wine. He brewed the family beer, those kind of things. So he knew alcohol very, very well.
Now it sounds like a good adjunct to a life as a butler. You know, you sort of continue in the same vein.
If you had the capital to...
If you had the capital to start up business. Well, isn't that the case today even?
Very, very much so. Very much so.
Yes. So, but the women would end up, what, just going into prostitution, or what?
Not necessarily. A maid would work until she could no longer work. Often these maids would bind together to try and survive. They could go back to their families sometimes by that point. Many of them had brothers who would marry and would give them a place. Again, they still worked, but it wasn't like they were working for a upper class family at that point. A lot of them chose to go to the workhouses instead of, being out on the street.
What was the workhouse like?
Well, I told you, this is where the box you sleep in at night.
That's where they had the box. Oh, my.
Yeah, and you were given one bowl of gruel and some hard physical labor. And the pictures I've seen of these workhouses, on the beams they had, pray to God, are you ready to meet your maker?
Oh, yes.
Death comes at the night, and all
dear.
that kind of, you had to listen
Gloom
to
and doom
fire
stuff.
and brimstone, doom and gloom constantly.
That didn't give them much hope for moving out into something that was a little bit more enlightening, did it?
There was no such
There
thing
wasn't
as
any
that.
such thing like that at all.
No, you're thinking about the middle class and above. You're not thinking about those who serve.
That's true. That's true.
And these really were the invisible people of this society, according to the society.
Right. And it's hard to believe that half the population would be servants.
It beats starving to death under the bridges.
That is absolutely true.
And given the choice, 3 square meals a day, a bed. Even if you have to share that bed, it's better than the rocks.
That is true. That is true.
Clean water to drink.
Well,
Tea.
yes. Well, these are all important things to consider when you're...
These are also some of the questions you asked. The mistress would ask you a great deal of questions in your job interview. Ask you about your references, ask you about your past jobs, ask to see your hands to make sure they were clean, ask you about your height, those kind of things. Tall maids were considered better because you could reach the higher places. But then you would also ask the mistress about your perks. How much tea do I get? What are the meals like? Servants, of course, did not come in the front door. You always came in through the back door
Right.
and up the stairs. Well, you walk through the kitchen. You took a look around that kitchen. Is it clean? Does the food smell good that's cooking? These are things. You did have a choice. The difference between slavery and servitude is that you can quit your job and find another one.
But you need a recommendation, you said. So
You need a recommendation, but you can always go to your mistress and say, my mother has broken her leg. I have to go home and take care of my mother.
I see.
And mistresses knew, once your mother got sick, this is your but you always gave them 2 weeks' notice.
I see. So that
was the unwritten rule. And these mistresses were quite cruel, and particularly the housemaids, because they were always testing their honesty. They would do things like slip a coin underneath the rug. Well, and they'd come back in the room and check. If the coin was still there, it meant that you didn't clean the room well enough.
Oh, dear.
If the coin was gone, it meant that you were a thief. So you take the coin and you put it on the mantelpiece. That was the etiquette. But a lot of maids took umbrage to this. Why is she testing my honesty for? I'm good at my job. You know, those kind of things were very, very prevalent.
Yes, indeed. I wanted to ask you about the shoes that they wore. I mean,
you want to see my feet?
Yes. I mean, you can hardly move in this corset that you're on. Look at those shoes.
Pointed toes, bit of a heel. I have a nice turned ankle. Maybe the master's son will see them and admire them.
So where did you get the shoes? Where did you find them?
These particular shoes I found many years ago at Nordstrom's when Victorian shoes were back in vogue, and these are modern shoes. They are not period shoes.
And so you sort of planned that you were going to be doing this, or have you used them for other?
No, I had planned.
You just saved it?
And I bought 2 pairs. And I'm kicking myself for not buying the other colors now. Because I do have a couple other shows I want to get on the boards. A partner show to this one called Twilight of an Era, Lifestyles Before the First World War. But it'll be many years before I get that one on the boards.
Well, it's been a while since you've been here, so it's taken you time to get this one developed.
It takes me anywhere from 2 to 6 years, usually on an average of 4 to 5, to put a new show together. Because when I do my programs, I talk for about an hour or so, and then I open it up for question and answer with the audience. And that's the fun part for me.
Sure, but you have to be very well informed and
I never
prepared to answer.
know what questions are going to throw at me, so I have to really do a lot of research, much more than I put into the program. So I can take it in the direction that the audience's questions go. And then that way, you know, I can find out what they're interested in and get them to participate. But I have to really know my stuff, because if you don't answer 3 questions in a night, you've lost your credibility, no matter how good your research has been.
Really?
So I spend months going through diaries and reading accounts of people and all of that.
So I can see why it takes you so long to do this.
And then finding the fabric.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Finding the shoes, you know, finding all that stuff and putting it together.
And then making it, putting it all together.
Trial and error with my sewing skills.
Well, I think you do very well, Tam. So you certainly have impressed me over the years that we've been doing these shows. And I think you're really a marvel.
Well, I have about 4 more shows I'd like to put in my repertoire if I possibly can.
Well, it'll happen.
Oh, it will.
It'll happen. Well, I want to thank you so much, Tams, for being my guest.
Well, thank you, ma'am, for having me.
Yeah, you're very welcome. You're terrific. And you'll have to come back again when you've got another program.
I will.
And to my viewers, I'd like to thank you very much for joining me on this wonderful episode with Tams Allen. And I hope you'll tune in next time when we explore yet another avenue of our universe and our relationship to it. I'm Elaine Smitha.